So, when they asked me like what time slot I wanted, I said not before lunch and not last. So I definitely got not last, but I definitely got before lunch, which is not always the coolest spot to be when you're at a conference. So I will stick to the time limit. You will not miss lunch, I promise. I am going to talk this morning about Lowell, Massachusetts, the history of Lowell, Massachusetts, but in particular the relationship between Lowell and the institution of slavery in the South, and a somewhat what I find to be incongruous history, which is that Lowell, along with being a city that depended exclusively on cotton to make itself work, also had a very large, very powerful anti-slavery movement. And so how did that come about? How did those two things coexist? And what can we learn from that? Now I got interested in this largely because I also teach immigration history. And the Lowell City Council was debating 3 or 4 years ago whether Lowell should be a sanctuary city with respect to immigrants and refugees coming in and all the politics around all of that, and people were using this word sanctuary and sanctuary cities. And one of the things that Lowell also has going for it is this tremendous amount of history walks in the summer on Saturdays and Sundays and weekday evenings and whatever. And I was asked to think about maybe doing something about abolitionism, anti-slavery, something about Lowell. And so I decided, okay, now I have both a compelling contemporary reason as well as a reason as a historian to try to figure this out. Hence, I started thinking about Lowell being a sanctuary city for fugitives before the American Civil War. And I wanted to try to figure that out as much as I could. So hopefully I will persuade you, and I also want to leave a little bit of time at the end to be sure to have some comment, discussion, conversation. And I think most people know this, although I think sometimes it gets missed, without cotton, there isn't any Lowell, and without the labor of enslaved people, there's no cotton. So you can make the argument that absent the institution of slavery, there might not be a Lowell. Certainly not the Lowell we think of today when people go there to visit the National Park or the Songus Industrial History Center or many of the other things that the city has. And so at the same time, the investors, the people that powered the growth and development, the built environment of the city, made their money on the slave trade. So in the 18th century, good numbers of people made tremendous amounts of money on what I learned in elementary school and in high school, the so-called triangular trade. This goes there, that goes there, whatever. And I just remember being taught about it, and nobody ever actually, people were sort of equated with cod and rum and molasses, and it just sort of, you just got it taught that way without much sort of moral kind of questioning about, well, wait, how are humans the equivalent of molasses and sugar and whatever? But as the slave trade is going to get closed in the United States, a lot of the moneyed folk, many of them living in this environment where we are this morning, have to think about, what else am I going to do with my money? I just don't want to sit on the pile of it. I want to do something with it. And so many of them begin to think about investing in manufacturing. We're a new nation. There's this whole debate going on between Hamilton and Jefferson and other people about what are we going to be when we grow up. And there's this sort of question about manufacturing. People obviously do. And this is a great quote from Sven Beckert's book. Highly recommend, if you haven't taken a look at it yet, if you're interested in this time period and the question, The Empire of Cotton, which came out in 2014. He actually came to the park and gave a talk about this book when it had first come out. And that there's just this interconnection, again, that's inextricable. And one of the things that sort of motivated me to think about this, and especially I think at a conference like this, is the fact that I feel like I teach in Lowell, and I live in Lowell, and I spend a lot of time walking around and thinking about this history. There's not a lot in the park or in any other way in the city that actually tells this story. There's a little bit, if you go to the Boot Mill Museum, there's a bale of cotton, there's some shackles, there's a diorama kind of effect of what a plantation would look like if you have ever gone. But there's not a lot that really tries to plumb out this history in any substantial way. And so one of my missions lately has been to try to get more signage and more stuff about this, and get more, and so doing the walking tours and other things became really important to me. So this gives you another way, again, of thinking about the same thing, the links between cotton and the city, and you can see as late as just on the eve of the Civil War, the vast amounts of cotton that are being consumed in the mills in Lowell. It's also true that in the bigger scheme of things with cotton from the South, the majority of it actually gets exported to Europe. England imports about 80% of the cotton from the South. Nonetheless, Lowell exists basically sort of because of this. And this is again from another book that's sort of trying to think through more, and this is a great quote. By virtue of our nation's history, American slavery is necessarily imprinted on the DNA of American capitalism. And so by extension, to me, I say that DNA is imprinted on Lowell, Massachusetts. And the city needs to understand that. The same way colleges and universities these days are being called to, the question is being called on them on what their linkages were and understanding and telling that story in a more vivid and a more bold way. I think the same thing has to happen in the city as we work our way forward. The other thing that's important to note is how much Massachusetts economy, not just Lowell, is linked to the institution of slavery. Massive amounts of the customers of other manufactured products in Massachusetts, boots, shoes, farm equipment, all sorts of things are sold to planters in the American South. And I think this quote, a little bit too long for me to read, but I can see you're all reading it as I'm talking, which is that's what was intended. I know you can all do two things at once. This, again, makes this connection, right? And I think this minister is actually saying, well, wait, you can't have it both ways, Massachusetts. You can't be selling us all this stuff and making money off of this institution, and then out one side of your mouth, and then out the other side, be all moral about the institution. And so, I mean, this, to me, again, is a quote that sort of calls the question, okay, well, okay, Lynn, which sells lots of boots, what are we doing here, right? And so in Lowell, again, this fascinating juxtaposition emerges that particularly religious institutions in the city, churches play a vanguard role in coming out against, arguing against the institution of slavery. Now, I'm sure you know, but just in case anybody doesn't, there's no unanimity of opinion about what abolition means, what anti-slavery means. You can go from a pretty vast spectrum of people, from one end of somebody like William Lloyd Garrison, immediate abolition, all the way over to people like President James Monroe, who sponsor and want to essentially colonize and repatriate Africans who were here back to Africa. And there's many stripes in between. So when I talk about abolitionism in Lowell, not everybody shares the same opinion, right? And so Garrison, Frederick Douglass, people like that frequently come to Lowell, make speeches, give talks, speak at anti-slavery conventions, anti-slavery rallies, but it runs the gamut. But religious institutions are big. And so in 1835, an anti-slavery society gets started in Lowell, and the first president is this guy, Theodore Edson, the minister of St. Anne's Church. And if you're familiar with Lowell at all, you've been to a park visit or a trolley tour or whatever, it's a big, beautiful stone church right on Merrimack Street in the heart of the city. At the time, right across from the town hall of the city as well. And he's pretty clear here in terms of what he thinks about, and this is a declaration of sentiments that people sign who belong to this anti-slavery society. Pretty straightforward. Sins against the laws of God and humanity. No person can be guilty of aiding or abetting those crimes without violating every principle of Christianity, of justice, and of morality. Pretty clear, pretty powerful, pretty strong statement. Another minister who plays a big role in the anti-slavery movement in the city is this gentleman, Eden Foster. And his church is notorious for Foster making very almost inflammatory anti-slavery speeches from the pulpit on Sundays, and the church gets referred to as Lowell's anti-slavery church. And it's known for what's being said there. And again, here's from Foster. We will strive by every means which we can conscientiously employ to overthrow the system of American slavery. This coming from the pulpit on Sunday in this church in the city. Edson's church also invites in free blacks as well as fugitives from slavery who have ended up in the city of Lowell, Massachusetts. They're welcomed into the church. Edson keeps diaries, writes almost every day, and in those diaries there's a lot about abolitionism, anti-slavery, what he sees going on. West Indian Emancipation Day in August 1st, 1838, he again sort of puts forward this position as well as the desirableness of immediate over gradual emancipation. Again, no equivocation here, very much aligning himself, as lots of the ministers in the city do, with William Lloyd Garrison and this notion of immediate abolition. This hall isn't anymore in downtown Lowell. It was the train station, but at the top of it was a gigantic meeting hall. If you again go to Lowell, and hopefully I'm intriguing you to come to Lowell and walk around if you haven't done that before, there's actually right where this building used to be, stone archway that looks just like that, which sort of marks where this building used to be. Anti-slavery conventions, New England-wide, Douglas, Garrison, and other people would have spoken there. For me, this is sort of like Lincoln slept here or whatever. It's sort of like when I find out that Douglas and Garrison made frequent trips to Lowell, which again are not like, there's not a sign. Like, I feel like there should be a sign, Douglas was here, somewhere, right? And somewhere in big, in public. This is another cool building. When I started doing the research, this building still stands on Dutton Street in Lowell. At the time, when it was first built, it was the home of the Mechanics Society in Lowell. Lowell had in it a gigantic machine shop, actually called quite cleverly named the Lowell Machine Shop. And it built lots of the machines that people used in the textile mills in the city. And so these were largely highly skilled workers. They had this building, which was where apprentices went to get training. They had a library with scientific books, technical books, all this stuff in the library on the upper floors. On the lower floors, they rented out store space to fugitives, who they knew were fugitives from the institution of slavery, who had come up from the south, ended up in Lowell, coming through the Underground Railroad, ending up with Edson's church. St. Anne's Church had a hideaway in the basement in case anybody came looking for people. And on the store level, across here were fruit stands, newsstands, barbershops, where in those stores people sold The Liberator, people sold Frederick Douglass's newspaper, The North Star. And again, people knew in the city of Lowell who these folks were who had escaped. In the stores themselves, cans like this it's a little bit difficult to see, but these were collection cans that would have been on the registers of lots of different stores and markets in the city to collect money to support the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society and the Underground Railroad. These would have been quite a bit around the town. Young women who worked in the mills, which is also key to this story, also were not all of them, but many of them were engaged in anti-slavery. There was a newspaper that was published in Lowell called The Voice of Industry. It was edited for a while by a woman named Sarah Bagley, who had worked in the textile mills and then ended up editing this worker newspaper. She and others who worked on the newspaper were very much involved in this question of anti-slavery. What was also fascinating as I dug in more, because I was trying to understand the connection between young women working in the cotton mills and being against the institution of slavery, the spread of slavery into Texas, other issues which we'll see in a couple minutes. And it turned out that several of the overseers of the mills in the city were Quakers, who were opposed to the institution of slavery, yet were overseers of these cotton mills in the city. And they encouraged their female workforce to sign petitions against the extension of slavery into Texas and other issues. But when those same women organized for a 10-hour day, they fired them. So I thought, oh, how unique. And so again, you get this really interesting juxtaposition where you have some of the overseers of the mills who are also good friends with Theodore Edson of St. Anne's Church. They have dinner in Edson's diary. He writes about this stuff. These folks are very much against the institution of slavery, and again, yet are managing cotton mills. As time passes, things become tense. And so one of the more famous incidents in the city is caused by the anti-slavery folks in the city inviting this guy, George Thompson, who's a British abolitionist, to come speak in downtown Lowell. And Thompson, because he's British, raises the passion of a lot of people who are anti-slavery, but can call out and say, do we want to let some British guy come here and tell us what to do? How can, to try to use the fact that Thompson's British, he comes and speaks in Lowell, no incidents at all. He comes back to speak again in December of 1834. From down on Merrimack Street, somebody chucks a big piece of rock through the plate glass windows, almost hits Thompson in the head. This becomes this really big incident that people are thinking about in the city. August of 1835, there's a big meeting in downtown Lowell in Faneuil Hall of people who are opposed to abolition. 1,500 people show up at this rally led by people who are connected to the mills, Abbott Lawrence and the Lawrence family, one of the large-scale investors in the city. And there's a comparable meeting that's going to be held in Lowell, organized by Kirk Boot, who's the overseer of the Boot Mill Complex in the city. And this is Mr. Boot. And there's a flyer that's put around town inviting people to come to this meeting to oppose abolitionism and to let our Southern brethren know, whatever you hear about Lowell, we still got your back. Don't worry about it. Even if you hear a lot of this stuff, don't believe it. And so people at the Songus Industrial History Center have done work identifying and figuring out who a lot of these folks are. And there's some of the people that would be some of the more wealthy folks connected to the mills. Kirk Boot, you can see his name right there. Boot carried a lot of weight in the city, but these are lots of doctors, lots of lawyers, lots of merchants who benefit from selling things to the mills. And this, again, becomes a really sort of fascinating way to think about this juxtaposition of people and views in the city. This comes from this comes from a Virginia newspaper after all this to-do in the city of Lowell. I'll read this one because it's pretty fascinating. Thus, the startling fact appears that the abolitionists have made such progress that in a town such as Lowell, they have not only a society and a press to aid them in their seditious and traitorous agitating pressure, but they have acquired such an influence, made so many converts, and infused into them such a fanatical and intolerant spirit that an anti-abolition meeting is not allowed to be held here. Now they just had the anti-abolition meeting a week before. So when I saw this, I said, "Wow, fake news before fake news." Who knew? We've done this all along. But anyway, sort of, again, appealing to the folks that this paper would appeal to. This is a finish of that same quote. But the proceedings at Lowell created doubt of the ability of our friends there being able to restrain, and the capitalism is theirs in the story, restrain the fanatics without action on the part of the South. It is in the South that the manufacturers of Lowell find the chief and best markets for the goods. The Southerners have only to cease purchasing them, and Lowell will wither or be forced to expel the abolitionists. Right? Again, these sorts of economic arguments and connections. Anti-slavery in Lowell, though, undeterred. This is a petition, statewide petition, to stop the annexation of Texas and turn it into a slave state. You can see in this petition, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down, Lowell, 1,400 signatures. And those are almost all female mill workers. It's a great document. Like, for any of you who do history, when you find something like this, it's like, oh boy, this is really something, right? A second petition that ends slavery in Washington, D.C., 1,640 female signatures on it. This is from Edson's diary, again showing the connections between churches, anti-slavery, and he writes this in this incredibly matter-of-fact way in his diary. And he talks about a fugitive coming from New York to New England, making their way from Salem to Andover, and then eventually to Lowell. And he finishes this passage, which I didn't put on here, but it's really the key to how matter-of-fact it is. He finishes that whole passage where he describes this with, "And my wife just got back from Boston on the train." So it's just second nature that he's sort of writing, understanding this, and it's not like, he's not writing this like this is a big deal. He's writing it like it's quite commonplace in what's happening in the city. Two of the folks that are going to figure in the last few minutes of what I want to do are fugitives who make their way into the city in the 1840s. And these are ads for their barbershops that were in the Lowell newspapers in the 1840s. And so one of them, Nathaniel Booth, and the second is Edwin Moore. So this is an ad from Booth, and this is an ad from Moore's store. Now, everybody in the city that frequents these places understands these are fugitives, that they've escaped from the South, and that they've been able to make their way into the city, start a business. They're advertising in the newspapers. They're selling Douglas's newspaper. They're selling Garrison's newspaper. They have the can on the counter raising money for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Just to make this even clearer, right, in terms of what we're talking about, the institution of slavery is not dying out. Some people make the argument, well, we don't need a fight, it's going to go away anyway. It's not. It's not. That's not what's happening. The record's pretty clear. The verdict is pretty well in. And so in order to protect their interests, in 1850, Southern politicians and people who are loyal to them in the North create a whole series of laws. Great Compromise of 1850, it's called. One of the pieces of that compromise is the Fugitive Slave Law. There had been laws on the books in the early 19th century that said if you knowingly harbored a fugitive, you were violating federal law. But as the 19th century progressed, as we're working our way forward, 1830, 1840, while sometimes people are obeying the law, in lots of other cases they're not. So in 1850, as part of this compromise, a new fugitive slave law is passed, making it mandatory that every Northerner essentially turn in anybody they know living amongst them who's a fugitive. And if they don't, they're violating federal law. So in Lowell, as the movement I've been sketching out builds, this becomes an incredible challenge to the city. Because as I just said before, there are knowingly a significant number of fugitives living, working, engaged in, involved in the social life and the business life of the city. And now people are being put in this position, okay, of what do we do? This just doesn't happen in Lowell, right? I mean, this happens in Boston. There's a very famous case, Anthony Burns in Boston, who's actually seized and marched through the streets of Boston and returned south in 1851. So you get ads like this appearing all the time, offering people rewards for turning people in. If you don't turn people in, you can be fined. You also can be imprisoned. So the mechanics that are renting that space in their hall could be put in jail. And also, law enforcement in Lowell, if they turn people in, could get a bounty for turning those folks in. So again, this becomes a pretty big deal, right? So again, if you were harboring somebody, you could be subject to about a $1,000 fine, $30,000 today. You could be put in jail. What happens is the city, the anti-slavery forces in the city join together and have this massive meeting in Lowell, and I'll show you some of the newspaper quotes about the meeting in a second, and they basically come out of that meeting saying no compliance with the Fugitive Slave Law. We're not doing it. People, this broadside is distributed again. This is in Boston. This is from the American Antiquarian Society, warning people in Boston in this case, but the same thing happened in Lowell, that slave catchers could be coming. And the thing about this was that if you were African and you were living in Lowell, you had been living there 25 or 30 years, somebody from the South could show up and say, that's my guy. The person doesn't have any right to an attorney. That person doesn't have any right to defend themselves. There's no jury. They can just be snatched off the streets of the city for as simple an act as somebody saying, yeah, that's her, that's him. And so, again, this becomes significant, a challenge in the city. So many of the fugitives living in Lowell leave, they flee. Right? They're concerned about their own safety, they're concerned about what might happen to them. And so this big meeting is held in October of 1850. These are quotes from the newspaper. The meeting at City Hall last evening was well attended. Chauncey Knapp, who's pictured here, made a motion unanimously accepted to the effect that all people who had left the city from fear of being captured should be telegraphed home, and the people of Lowell would see to it that they be protected. Knapp stated a willingness, quote, to suffer death rather than let a fugitive slave be caught when it was in his power to prevent it. The motion is unanimously accepted. One of the things that happens in the newspaper when this all takes place and people flee, there's a little funny in context, ad sort of a piece in one of the Lowell newspapers that essentially bemoans the fact that so many people have left, and one of the taglines in it is, where are we going to get our hair cut? Because so many of the people who have left own or either own barbershops or work in barbershops. And so people, that's like one of the tags, right? Knapp is part of the Free Soil Party in the time period that we're talking about. He's working for a while in the city as editor of the Middlesex Standard, an anti-slavery newspaper which had been edited by John Greenleaf Whittier, and eventually he edits this other newspaper called the Lowell Citizen and News. But it's significant, again, that this all takes place. Slave catchers do show up. Here's an article that's in one of the newspapers warning people that, in fact, these characters are here. At one point, people show up and actually want to get Booth. Booth has come back. The telegrams and him being told people will protect him. With all of that, he comes back. He lives with a free African family living in Lowell at the time. Slave catchers come. A bunch of the anti-slavery ministers and other people in the city basically pay off the slave catcher to leave town, but not with Booth. And at the end of it all, nobody is taken from the city of Lowell for the duration up into the Civil War. In 1855, Massachusetts passes personal liberty laws, which basically make it, basically they nullify, right, talk about states' rights. This is Massachusetts-style state rights. They nullify the Fugitive Slave Act. They say, yeah, Fugitive Slave Act doesn't go here in the Commonwealth. And essentially, the South, in the run-up to the war, this becomes one of the things the South is upset about. Well, wait, they're just abrogating federal law. Can they do that? But in fact, the Massachusetts legislature does. The South, but again, Lowell stands strong. Nobody's returned. This is the shameless promotion for the Lowell Walks. Dick Howe is sitting right here, and right there in the front, who was the original mover, shaker, organizer for all these walks. This is me giving one of the anti-slavery walks in downtown Lowell, and we're stopped actually at a spot where if you look across the street, you can see the building which is still standing where Booth's barbershop was. And it's now a hairdresser school. So it's actually quite fascinating. The first time I walked around and figured out where Booth's barbershop was, and I said, I'll be damned. It's like the New England School of Hairdressing or something. It's like, okay, what's the odds, what's the likelihood? All right, so I'm going to stop here and see we have a few minutes to chat, talk, comments, questions. Thank you very much. I saw a hand somewhere, so I want to go on really quick.
No, I was curious if you knew the address of the Dutton Street building that I used to live on Dutton.
The Dutton Street one is where Community Teamwork Incorporated is now.
Okay.
So it's sort of right across from where you would take if you're going down Dutton, where you would take a right to go down Market Street,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yep. Okay.
So it's, the thing about it is, again, like in trying to figure out how to do the walk, I realized, so St. Anne's Church is sort of like if you made a map of the city, St. Anne's Church, the mechanics building, Huntington Hall, the town hall where the whole incident with George Thompson occurred, all of those are just like within a block of each other. And then where a lot of these other, where Booth's shop and others are, is just really down the road from there. There's also a small but active free black community in the city, carpenters and tradespeople, lots of them coming from islands in the Caribbean. And somehow they end up making their way into Lowell. And a lot of the fugitives then also live in that same neighborhood. And so when Douglas or Garrison come to Lowell, they stay with folks in that neighborhood. So unfortunately, that neighborhood got obliterated in urban renewal in the 1970s. So there's nothing. There's no there could be artifacts underground from the talk I heard just a few minutes ago, but nobody's ever bought. I don't think anybody's ever tried digging there. It became a shopping mall, a Zayre's Plaza, or whatever the heck they called them back in those days. Yes?
So, what was the effect of like the Irish coming in at that time, and like the Irish acre, and wasn't that about the same time that they were?
Yep. So the big Irish influx into Lowell comes in the 1840s, the potato famine, 1845. There's a small but significant Irish population in Lowell well before this that actually build the city. The canals are dug, a lot of the mills are being built. There's a guy, Hugh Kaminsky, an Irishman who's in Lowell already, and he recruits Irish workers from Charlestown. And so but that population grows, there becomes a neighborhood called the Acre, which is where they live. I haven't been able to figure out much about where they are vis-a-vis abolitionism, anti-slavery. There's not a lot in the newspapers and things that I've read that talks about, in one way or another, where they stand. There's heavy anti-Catholic sentiment in Lowell in 1851 when the know-nothings in Massachusetts politics are riding high. Sounds like today. Not in Massachusetts, but in general, know-nothings, that reference anyway. They actually go and march into the acre to try to burn down St. Patrick's Church, the Irish Catholic Church in the acre neighborhood. So there's a lot of turmoil.
Slavery, but not the Irish.
Pardon me?
They were okay with slaves coming in, but not the Irish.
Yeah, or they were okay with cotton, and they were okay with fugitives coming, some of them. But again, it's not clear to me how all of this lines up. The curious actor in all of this to me is somebody like Kirk Booth, right, who's very influential but then dies before a lot of this stuff jumps off. But he's responsible for organizing that anti-slavery rally. He's also responsible for building St. Anne's Church, and much to his chagrin later, he's the one that recruits Edson to be the minister of St. Anne's Church, and Edson then turns out to be somebody very much that Kirk Booth didn't necessarily care for. And Edson stays the minister of St. Anne's for much of the 19th century. But the churches are really key. There's a Methodist church in the city that's also very prominent. At one point, if you're familiar with the Amistad case, a lot of you, when that case is finally decided in the Supreme Court, and the folks who hijacked that ship off Cuba and eventually arrested, they spend a lot of time in jail. The case ultimately goes to the Supreme Court, whether they had a right to essentially kill their captors and escape. And the court rules actually that they did. One of the first places that whole crowd of people come after that is Lowell. And they make this huge performance at St. Paul, no, St. Paul's Methodist Church? Is it St. Paul's? Thank you. St. Paul's Methodist Church, which is today the United Teen Equality Center, a youth organization, a very powerful one in the city. But the building still stands. The hall where people spoke still stands. There are incredible newspaper accounts. So many people showed up, people had to be outside. Several thousand people came. And they were coming explicitly to raise money to buy a ship to return to Africa. And they got, which I often, like again, sort of like history time machine, if there was such a thing as like downstairs, only it was real. They take a tour of the boot mill. I often wondered what that had to have looked like, or sounded like, or been like. And the newspaper accounts say that mill workers, young, mostly female mill workers, went up to them as they came through and gave them what little change they had in their pockets, because they knew they were there to raise funds to buy this ship. So it had to be like an incredible drama. They spent about a week in the city. I'd love to know more about that, but that hall still sits right there in the downtown, right off the downtown.
What hall was it? Sorry.
This was where the Amistad folks went. That was,
What was the name of it?
it was St. Paul's Methodist Church. Yep. Yes.
The graph that you drew up there, I was kind of surprised by the number of women and the ratio of women to men inside the mills. So my first question is, was that a kind of a normal thing in the time? And then, of the percentage of that, was there a lot of African Americans, if any, working in the mills?
So the answer to the second question is easier, no. There may have been a small number, but nobody. I've not seen anything credible where anybody's turned up. Most of the black population living in Lowell were tradespeople, carpenters, things like that, stonemasons, or they ran shops. They were not necessarily employed in the mills. It was conscious in the building of Lowell to have young women be the primary workforce. And the idea was that as Lowell is being built, we don't want, in America, mills to look like Liverpool or Manchester. We don't want urban slums. We don't want degraded workforces. We don't want Marxist proletariat, right? So we'll bring in a bunch of young women, they'll work for 2 years, and then they'll go home and get married. That was the logic, right?
Is that just in Lowell, or did you see that in other cities?
It was in like Manchester, New Hampshire. It was in a lot of the mills that the same collection of people started. Other shops were different. You know, depending, like the Lowell machine shop was mostly men, right? And so it varied, but it was very explicit in building textile mills. They also thought this female workforce would be very docile. But what happens fairly quickly, by the mid-1830s, these young women are going out on strike, they're walking off the job, they're protesting raises in boarding house rents, they're opposing wage cuts, they're campaigning for a 10-hour day, they're making connections, which I think is really important to realize. Several of the women who are sort of leading all of this in Lowell make very explicit connections between being opposed to slavery, being in favor of the 10-hour day, and women having the right to vote. And they say we cannot influence these other two things if we can't vote. And so there early on, when I do the walking tour, I refer to them as triple threats. Because the sort of what I think of as three of the leading issues of the day, anti-slavery, shorter workday and safer work, and women's right to vote, they've made those connections, and they make them in the voice of industry and in other ways. The voice of industry, by the way, if you're interested, people several years ago completely digitized that entire newspaper. So if you go on your fancy computer or phone and you type in voice of industry, it will direct you to the site. Every issue of the paper, it's searchable. It's an incredible resource. It's absolutely brilliant that people did that, because usually those sorts of newspapers don't get digitized. We can read the Globe and the New York Times and whatever, but that the voice of industry is there. Yes?
What were the arguments?
I'm being conscious of lunch, don't worry.
What were the arguments anti-abolitionists were making to people in Lowell?
The argument anti-abolitionists were making is that slavery is legal.
That was it?
Yeah. How can you be against it? It's legal. I mean, they would be more maybe nuanced than I am, but I don't know. I don't want to nuance it.
No racist argument built into it? No fear of free blacks coming into your job?
Yeah, some of that too, but that wasn't a persuasive argument in the North. But, I mean, as the institution is expanding, right, then people have to debate more politically. That's why we get, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and we get the we get the Missouri Compromise, we get all of those political things. The fact remains that for all this period, the South has outsized political influence, right? Because all of the enslaved people are counted for electoral purposes in the House of Representatives, each as 3/5 of a person, but they can't vote, right? So as we work our way forward toward ultimately the Civil War, it's difficult for the North to amass the political power inside the House and inside the Senate. And so the debates are not about ending the institution as much as can it go here, can it go there, how do we create a balance? So if we bring in a slave state, we have to bring in a free state, all this stuff that we all were bored to tears with in high school history class. We should have been taught better than it was. Yes?
Two small questions. Is that 3/5 of a person or 3/5 of a man? Is it the men?
3/5 of a man.
Okay. Second small question. Is there a record of whether those churches in Lowell their congregations sat side by side, or were they segregated like in some abolitionists?
I don't know.
Don't know if there's records.
I haven't seen anything. I know Edson's diaries and stuff in the newspapers and whatnot. Edson welcomed anybody into the church and people came, but I don't know. I haven't found it. I'd maybe like to, but I haven't. And I haven't seen it in his diaries either, so I don't know. If anybody knows, yell and tell me. I don't know. I mean, one of the big issues in anti-slavery conventions was separating men and women, right? And sort of Douglas was one of the most outspoken people about saying, what are we doing? We're trying to figure all this out, and we're like saying women can only be up there. And so he also saw these interconnections in pretty vivid ways. But I don't know. I think we have time for one more. Now we can race and get there first. Yes?
Earlier you spoke about how the South proposed boycotting the finished goods try to convince them to
Right.
give up the abolitionist movement. Since the South had a big market for the raw materials in England, why didn't they just stop, sending the raw materials up there?
Yeah.
It would have been easier, would have seen the boycotting thing, it would have been more effective, it seems.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's a great question. Question, if you didn't hear it, was, well, if the South was threatening to not buy stuff produced in Massachusetts, why not stop shipping cotton to the North until the North relented, or in Lowell, I guess, they kicked the fanatical abolitionists out of Lowell, which they were calling for. I don't, again, in anything I've seen, I don't know that ever happened. I don't see anywhere in what I know about Lowell where there was a shortage of cotton through this particular period of time. The shortage comes with the war, obviously. But Lowell was stockpiling cotton before the war. Then they get too cute and sell it thinking the war will be short. And then as the war drags on, they have no cotton, and they have to actually shut a lot of mills down. But yeah, you're right. When I found that quote, I thought, well, why didn't you? Right? I mean, I'll say I guess the last point I want to make is that I think we have to figure out, the same way now colleges and universities are sort of going through this internal audit, if you will, like Brown or Georgetown or Harvard or Yale, about their connections to money from the slave trade, sort of their complicity, and in fact Georgetown selling enslaved people that they owned as a way to make money for the college, right? I do think northern mill cities that have this history that I've sketched out only briefly ought to come to grips with that as well, and ought to be able to talk about it and sort of understand it, right? Which again is why I thought about this in the context of what's going on with immigrants and refugees today. We need to figure out how, at least I do as a teacher, how can I connect up and intersect these issues across time, right? So thank you very much. Have a great rest of the time. Run and you can get to lunch before anybody else.